When you open your Bible and you read it, we all read it, right? Have you ever wondered how the Romans got to Judea, what they were doing there? And have you ever thought about the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Where did those guys come from? In other words, they weren't always there. So if you open the New Testament and you just look into it without knowing this other information, it just seems like they were always there. And that is not the case. They weren't always there. And so I'm curious, as you probably figured out, and I got to looking at the Romans and how they got into the New Testament. I mean, they worked their way in there somehow. And so I started exploring that, and I uncovered a lot of information. It was new to me, and if you're familiar with the Romans in the New Testament and how they got there, then it wouldn't be new information for you. But out of that, I realized that the Romans had a huge impact on Christianity, and they were part of God's plan. They are one of God's instruments for making things happen. And in fact, Daniel prophesied that they're going to show up in his prophecies. And so with that, I decided this is going to require a road trip. And so I decided that we're going to start today, we're going to talk about the players. Who were they? Some of them up there you may not recognize as players, but they're really part of this overall story. So I decided that we'd take some journeys, road trips. And the first one will be the road to the cross. How did Rome get to where they were when Christ was crucified? Where did they come from? What were the events that led up to that? Where did the Pharisees and the Sadducees come down? And we know the narrative from the New Testament already. We know basically who the Sadducees and Pharisees were. But what we may not know is what their origins were and what their interactions with the Romans were. And so we're going to explore that. And then we're going to take another trip to the destruction of the temple. Now think about this for a second. This is a huge structure. It is made out of limestone. So how do you burn a building like that down? And this building was not small. It was huge. And so how does one do that? And the question is, were the Romans completely responsible for that? And I'm going to, spoiler alert, no, they were not. Okay. And we're going to explore that and talk about it. And then the road to the Christianization of the Roman Empire. We know that happened. And the question is what did the Romans have to do with it? Did they help that along? Did they inadvertently help it along? And there's some of both there. So that's kind of how the class is going to be organized. So it's going to be, today we'll talk about the players, and then we'll talk about the road to the cross. The following week is the temple destruction, and then the road to the Christianization. These classes, the first two, the players and the road to the cross, are on the church app. Okay, notice I haven't printed anything out because I would kill a really big tree in that case. So anyway, and the other two will be up probably next week. So all of those will be there. The classes, they're they're set up with, there's a lot of narrative in there, a lot of notes. Okay, I did that for me because I can't remember everything. I didn't do it for you. You can use it to read and edify yourself a bit. Okay, so here we go. So why not, but this is another preliminary, why not just use the Bible for this kind of class? And the answer is the Bible is not a historical document. It's a theological document with history in it. So there are a lot of gaps in the history associated with the Bible. And the Bible, every time historians find things or archaeologists, the Bible has always been corroborated, 100%. There's never been any question about whether there was truth there. And the reason is, the Bible is true. So they use these external pieces of information, and it corroborates the Bible because it's true. Okay. Now, something to think about, to consider is this, is the writers of the New Testament had knowledge that we don't have. In other words, there were things that when the writers wrote the New Testament, there was information that they had, and we don't have that information. So it was from their own time that we don't have. The one thing that is consistent is the message from God. The message from God to them 2,000 years ago is the same as the message to us 2,000 years later. The message is the same, but the background information, they assumed that you just knew this. They assumed that you knew about the Romans. They assumed that you knew about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the issues that they had between them. They assumed that you knew all of the things associated with crucifixion, that it was Christ's death was going to end in crucifixion. He got crossways with the Sadducees and Pharisees. They knew that probably that would happen because it always happened. And so that was kind of background information that they knew. So we go other places. We use the Bible as much as we can, but we're going to depend on guys like Josephus and Nicholas of Damascus. And Josephus, it turns out, is a really important character in this narrative when we talk about the destruction of the temple. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about him. One thing to be aware of, if you're ever reading about like the Herod or the emperors, those kings, the historians who wrote about them were very careful to put the emperor or the king in a good light because they were the patrons of these historians. So, and in Herod's case, if you said something about him, it was, you could find yourself dead. Okay, so they had to be very mindful of that. There are other things. We'll pick up some information from the Apocrypha because it's in First Maccabees. It talks about the Maccabees, and it's fairly accurate. Josephus, except for, again, about the Emperor Vespasian. Nicholas, except for where Herod is involved. Then the Roman histories, there's lots of historians that wrote, and there's a really long list of them that wrote about these different histories and things that were occurring at the time, and then ancient history for them. So ancient history for them 2,000 years ago was 2,000 years prior. Okay, so they were writing all of these historical events that occurred. Also, there's Roman legal documents. When I was talking about where the Bible came from, there was some discussion about some of the court proceedings that the Romans had, And all of those events are recorded in their legal documents. So, and one last note, then governmental documents. The Romans were thugs, no doubt about it. They overran these different regions and eventually controlled the whole region around the Mediterranean. And they were very brutal. However, they were very organized, and they recorded everything. So that is one of the places that we get a lot of this information from. So just kind of keep that in mind. And archaeology, I got a slide in here that you'll find interesting about Caiaphas. So we're going to talk about the players. These are the players: the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Idumeans. I mean, who are those guys? You never hear about them, but we actually did hear about them. We just don't recognize them. The Seleucids, the Romans, and of course the Parthians. And you may ask, who are the Parthians? And what do they have to do with this whole story? And actually, they do have a part in the story. So we'll get to that. So what we're going to do is we'll back up. We'll talk briefly about the Maccabees, and then what are the origins, and then what did they believe, and some of the characteristics of the different factions. But first thing we're going to start is we're going to roll back for just a moment back to Alexander. Alexander conquered this entire region here. The Ptolemies were down here. Seleucids ended up being down here. And afterwards. So he controlled this all the way to the Hindu Kush. And so it was like all the way to India, all the way down in here in North Africa. And he died on the way home. He had been out looking for passageways to make things faster, to traverse over to, so they could go further and further east. Well, he dies. And that leaves his generals in charge of the entire empire. What happens? War breaks out. The Ptolemies shoot out down into Egypt, down in this region here. The Seleucids start control. There's actually was somebody else here, and the Seleucids finally overran them. These were some of the other generals here. Okay, the Ptolemies, and there was a war back and forth here. Guess what's right in here? Israel, right? Judea, right? And so these armies were marching back and forth through there. But eventually the Ptolemies went out, and for a long time the Ptolemies controlled that region. The Jews did pretty good. There was a couple of those leaders that didn't really like them. Remember, these people are Greeks, the leaders. They're all Greeks. And so, and then eventually, they fell back, and their power started to decline. And eventually the Seleucids took over this region. And basically, Syria, which is right in this region right here, eventually is an outcome of the Seleucids. Eventually, this whole empire falls apart. So that's kind of the picture when the whole thing starts. This was in 301 BC, but we pick up the story about the Pharisees in about 167. So in the Pharisees, they basically, their origins actually go all the way back to Babylon. And one of the big things that they were keen on was the Jewish national identity. They did not want that to be lost. And so the Chassidim or the Hasidim, and if that sounds familiar, the Hasidim, the Hasidic Jews, these are their precursors. And through history, you can follow those guys all along. So they were very conservative, and when Mattathias Maccabeus rebelled against the Seleucids, okay, so the Seleucids were going to Hellenize everybody. This was an outcome of Alexander the Great, who thought it was a great idea that everybody be Greek, right? So speak Greek, act Greek, have Greek gods, the whole deal. And the Seleucids continued that. The Chasidum signed on with Judas Maccabee, or excuse me, we're talking about Mattathias. The Mattathias was, there was a contingent from the king of the Seleucids to Modine, which is one of the small towns in Judea that Mattathias was the priest of, so he was the leader of that community. And they built an altar to these pagan gods, and all of the Jews were invited to do a sacrifice. And Mattathias was invited to be the first one, since he was the leader of the community. He declines. And he said, no, thank you. Another Jew comes up and goes, oh, no problem, I'll do that. And Mattathias, in a rage, pulls out a sword and he kills this guy. And then he and his sons proceed to kill the entire army contingent that was there. So that was the start of the Maccabean rebellion. That group of fighters retreat into the hills, and it was the start of a guerrilla war with the Seleucids. And they were a real pain in the neck for the Seleucids. And eventually it became a real war with the different armies, because Mattathias's the soldiers, they kept going to them, and that army kept growing. So eventually the Seleucids ran into these armies. Now, Mattathias was an old man, and so in about a year after the rebellion started, he dies. But the Chasidum are still around, and they were absolutely opposed to the Hellenists. They detested the Hellenists. And so they sign on with Judas Maccabee, who is I think he was the middle son of Mattathias, and he became the leader of the Maccabees. And so they fight with Judas against the Seleucids, and basically their goal was to get back to Jerusalem and control the temple. So Judas and the Maccabees was their ticket to get back there. That's what their goal was. Okay, so interestingly, which is something that I didn't know, was Judas sent a proposal to Rome, because Rome was expanding, and they were starting to be a real military power. They had expanded. They had already conquered part of North Africa, and they were moving eastward. Well, the Jews knew about the Romans. They knew they were out there. And so he sends a letter to the Roman Senate. And this was the agreement that they came back with. If war comes to Rome, the Jews will act as allies, and they won't help the other guys. Likewise, if war comes to the Jews, Rome shall act as their allies, and they won't help them. So it was this mutual pact that they had with the Romans. And the Senate agreed to that. But before that got put in place in the summer, the fighting continued. In 162 BC, the Syrians had the Maccabees bottled up in Jerusalem. And this general, Lysias, gets a note. There's a rebellion. So this is the Seleucid Empire. There's a rebellion going on. You guys need to come home and help. And so there is a treaty in 162 with this guy, between Judas and this guy, and the Jews were allowed to return home and live with their own customs. Okay, so the the Seleucids withdraw and leave the Jews alone for the moment. At that point, the Chasidum, abandoned Judas altogether. And the reason is because they were in Jerusalem and they had the temple, and that's all they wanted. And after that, they wouldn't fight with him. So they wouldn't fight the Syrians or the Seleucids anymore, and they were not interested in politics or that. All they were interested in was the law and the temple. That was it. So he lost a major piece of his army. It was not a few people, it was a lot of people. But they went on, and Judas was killed in 160 BC, fought 24 battles with the Seleucids. And that's a lot of battles, and finally his number was up, and he got killed. But at that point, the war transformed from a war of outrage, from the Seleucids wanting to Hellenize everybody, to a war of independence against the Seleucids. And that war continued on for quite a while. Okay. So we're getting to the Pharisees, just hang loose here. But this is the background of where those guys came from. This is important. So Simon Maccabee took over the leadership after Jonathan was murdered, and he unified these opposing parties, the Hellenists, the Chasidum, and the Maccabees, into a cohesive group. And that was no easy feat, because the Chasidum detested the Hellenists, and the Hellenists detested the Chasidum. And so this was, he was really, it was pretty a miracle, actually, that he was able to get them to talk to each other. In 142 BC, Syria released the Jews from all taxes, and they granted political independence for the Jews. Okay, and when that happened, the Jewish people made. Oops, I think I skipped one. The Simon, the absolute sovereign, and he became the hereditary leader of the Jews. Okay, now prior to that, the king of Syria had made. You know what? Instead of me guessing, let me go back. Jonathan, which was another brother, he got control of Jerusalem in 153. Jonathan supported the Demetrius, who was the king of Syria. And interesting that he had been fighting against these guys, and now all of a sudden they got another war, and now he supports them. And so with men and material, and Demetrius wins. And so the Demetrius makes him the king priest of Jerusalem, of the Judeans. Okay, this is where the high priest and the civil governor. This is important when we get to talking about during Christ's time. The high priest becomes the civil governor and also the high priest. So he was religious and the civil leader. This is when that happened. Interestingly, it wasn't a Jew that did it, it was the Syrians that did it. So that's just kind of one of those things. And Jonathan oversaw the Feast of the Tabernacles, and he officiated as high priest, which was legal. He was of the line of priests. And so the Chasidum joined him permanently, and he was the king and the political, and the Chasidum were concerned about the religion. And so they controlled the temple. He was the government, the civil government. Okay, he got murdered. Okay, all right. And then enter Simon. Okay, so he took over after Jonathan was murdered. And then he's the one that combined or unified those parties. Okay, after this treaty with Syria, and they were basically released from all taxes and granted basically their independence, the Jewish people then made Simon absolute sovereign. And that's when that station became hereditary. So if you look at going all the way down to Ananias and Caiaphas, that whole line there was a hereditary appointment, basically. And that was the outfall of that action by the Jewish people. Enter the Romans again. There was another treaty with Rome, and Rome actually recognized the Jews as an independent nation. And they sent letters out to all of the surrounding countries saying, hands off, because if you bother the Jews, there'll be war with us. And so that gave the Jews an opportunity to start expanding the kingdom. Okay? And that happened. Interestingly, because of the previous, this absolute sovereign and the priest king being the civil part of the government, okay, the Romans only recognized the high priest as the leader of the Jews. And you see that when we get to Pilate. Who does he talk to? Caiaphas. And the rest of the Jews didn't actually matter to him. It was that person, because he was the civil authority there, speaking for the Jews. Simon got murdered, okay? I mean, it was real tough being a leader back then, okay? It was terminal, absolutely. Okay, and this is a whole story in and of itself. But anyway, Simon gets murdered along with the sons, except for one son, and his name is John Hyrcanus. And basically, he was warned of the treachery, and he assumed the dignity of high priest, but he wouldn't take the title of king. But he was still the civil authority there. He was the first of the Hasmoneans, so was John Hyrcanus. Now, the Pharisees show up around 135 BC. So they had been called out as, or they're historically they were the Chasidum, but John Hyrcanus calls them out by name, and he calls them the separated ones. That's the Pharisees. Okay, and there we say it. There are other things to call them, but anyway, John Hyrcanus is the one who called him out. John Hyrcanus was a Pharisee when he started. Okay. Okay. So, what about the Pharisees? So, I mean, that's kind of where they came from. But what about them? And we know from reading the New Testament that they were real hot on legalism. They followed the Torah, and after the return after Cyrus sent them home, right? Emphasis was placed on the study of the law, which we know that because Ezra was there, and he was sent specifically to help them relearn the Old Testament. And so, they did not necessarily worship in the temple anymore, necessarily. It was primarily in the synagogues. They were real hot on nationalism. I've already talked about this Babylonian captivity. And they basically, it was against the Babylonians, the Seleucids, and they were real staunch nationalists. If you weren't a Jew, then you were nobody. Okay, they tended to be more middle class, and they controlled the synagogues. All of the preaching and teaching was done there. And okay, so I've already said that they were conservative. And this was one of the big things. They were very concerned about the secularization of the Jewish people, and hence the nationalism. The other thing is back to Alexander. There were a lot of Greeks in that region. Why? Because Alexander had transplanted them there, because everybody was going to be Greek. And everybody was going to speak Greek, they were going to act Greek, they're going to try to have the same customs. And so they had a real problem with the Greeks. Okay, now the scribes, which this is something that I did not know, and I discovered, is that in Matthew 23, if you pull out the NASB version of that, yeah, if you look in there, you will see that Jesus excoriates the Pharisees and the scribes. But what does he do? He says, "You scribes and Pharisees," and I often wondered, I like the scribes. The scribes carried the traditions forward. They did all of the writing. And so I often wondered, these guys just wrote letters. Okay? Why would Jesus go after them the way he did? And the answer is that they were a small group within the Pharisees, and they were like ultra conservatives. And they are the ones that actually trace back to the Chasidum. They were responsible for carrying forth the traditions, which is one of the jobs of the scribes. But what they did was they took it to extremes. And the oral law became the Talmud, which eventually happened. And then the Mosaic law was the written law. But this is what happened. They drove the oral traditions, adding more and more and more and more things onto the tasks or the things that the Jews needed to do, until basically just a regular Jew couldn't do them. And so that's what Jesus encounters in Matthew 23. Did you pull up Matthew 23? Okay, so just go over to about, I think, 13 or something like that, and where the woes start. Go ahead.
You bet. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers, therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves.
Okay.
Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? So Jesus really went after these guys. And the scribes, that was, like I said, that was something that I was always questioned. Why would he do that? That's why right there. So, and this was, their problem was they wore their religion outside. So everybody knew that they were very religious. They had their phylacteries very large. They had, phylactery was the little band with the little box on it that they carried verses from, right? Mm-hmm. Without a bill. Anyway, just saying. They had their very large tassels and hymns.
and so everybody could see it. And that is absolutely what God didn't want, and he doesn't want us to do, because God looks at the heart. He does not look at outside things, right? And it's a good thing, because while Bill is this masculine, this model of man, take a look at me now, okay? And this was the big thing that and it's mentioned in there that was already read. Their washing rituals and the long prayers and the salutations as rabbi. That was a big thing for them, right? And they forgot about God. That's what they forgot. And so they resented the priesthood control of the temple and the civil authority being combined. They did not like that at all. And that gets traced all the way back to Jonathan Maccabee. And so this whole time, there's this animosity going on. Okay?
When you say they, Dan, you mean
The Pharisees.
The Pharisees.
Mm-hmm. Now we're going to talk about the Sadducees. So they show up around the same time as the Pharisees. And it turns out that these are, around 135 BC, they're effectively a political party, just like the Pharisees. Okay? And remember, John Hyrcanus, the first of the Hasmoneans, was a Pharisee. So they were an outcome of the Hellenization of the Jews, and they basically embraced the Greek way of life, basically. In this sense, they were quite liberal, and that goes back to when this. But the interesting thing is when they looked at themselves, they thought they were very conservative. And because they didn't want anything to change, they liked things the way they were. And why? Because usually they were in control of the temple. And what happens at the temple? The wealth flows through the temple. And so they controlled the wealth, and because of that, then they were able to peel off money and fund their lavish lifestyles. So they tended to be very wealthy landowners, and this is where they got a lot of their money. Okay, their goal was to maintain the priestly caste in control of the temple, and that was back to John Hyrcanus. So Caiaphas and Annas they were outcomes of that. They were Sadducees. Both of them were. And they were in control basically of everything there. They rejected oral law, insisted on literal interpretation. They thought that the traditions that the Pharisees put forward were nice ideas, but that they didn't really live by them. And this is I've seen this several places. You can compare the Sadducees to the mafia. Okay, they ripped off regular Jews, and I saw this example. So a regular Jew comes to the temple to sacrifice, brings a lamb. Okay, and the law says the lamb has to be perfect. So surely that person had brought a lamb that was perfect. Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought it. They bring it in. They're met at the door by a Sadducee who's controlling the entry into where they're going to do the sacrifices. And he says, that lamb is not perfect. You can't sacrifice it. However, okay, for a small fee, I have a whole collection of perfect lambs over here. Okay? And so the Jew pulls out his money. Oh, but wait, you can't use that money. You have to go to the money changer and get the right kind of money for a fee, small fee. So he would go over there, get the money, come back, and then he would buy this perfect lamb from over here, right? And then he would go on in and they would sacrifice. Then the Sadducee would take the lamb that was not perfect and put it over here with the perfect lambs. So the next Jew that came in would go through the same process. And so they were ripping off the regular folks. And the Jewish population, they knew this was happening. And they detested the Sadducees. So just in general, they didn't like them. So during the Roman occupation, the Sadducees wanted peace. Why? Because the Romans didn't care if they were ripping anybody off. The Romans wanted no fighting, no turmoil, and taxes. And so if you provided those things, you're good. And so basically, if you recall, Caiaphas talks about sacrificing one man for the peace. That's what he was talking about. They did not want any kind of turmoil during the Passover because there would have been big riots. So he was trying to control that situation. Why? Because he was the civil authority for the Jews. Okay. And speaking of Caiaphas, that's where Caiaphas is, his bones anyway. So that was found in 1990 in a burial cave in Jerusalem. And what the Jews would do is, if you didn't know this, when you died, they'd put you in the tomb, wrap you all up, and cover the door, because it was really stinky when your body was decaying. Okay? In about a year, they would come, clean off the bones, and stick you in an ossuary. And that's where Caiaphas is in there. And he may be in there with his mother-in-law. We don't know. They would take the other pieces of folks in the family and stick them in there also. Okay, so anyway, I thought you might find that interesting. Anyway, okay, yes. Because it's labeled on there that, you can't read it, but Josephus could read it. And it says, Joseph, who was called Caiaphas of the high priesthood. So there's high confidence that Caiaphas is actually in there, because that's inscribed on that ossuary. Okay, so the Sadducees tended to be wealthy. They were secular. There were not many Sadducees. They did not believe that God intervenes or is active in our lives. God is hands-off. They followed the Pentateuch or the Mosaic Law only. And interestingly, they did not believe in angels. And so in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there are visitors that come. And of course, they studied that, but they basically ignored that. They generally controlled the temple as hereditary priests. They did not believe in the resurrection. Okay. In Acts, right, Paul gets pulled into the Sanhedrin, right? And they're discussing what they should do with him. And Paul looks around and he sees, there are Pharisees here, and there are also Sadducees here. What does he do? And he knew this. He did this on purpose. He says, I'm a Pharisee, and I believe in the resurrection. And what happens? A riot breaks out, right? The Romans come, and they rescue him, right? He did that on purpose because he knew the Sadducees and the Pharisees had this thing about the resurrection. And so he did that intentionally. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, and they believe when you're dead, pretty much. Okay. The Essenes rose out of total disgust for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They didn't like either of those groups. And they felt that Jerusalem and the temple, that whole thing had been defiled by the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But they didn't believe in free will. They predestiny only. That was their thing. Also, They're in Qumran, but they were all over Judea. So it wasn't just that one small group. And Qumran did not escape the Romans. The Romans took it over also. So they didn't escape the Roman attacks. So not a lot's known about them. They're not mentioned in the Bible, but they were actually there. And there's a lot of historical documents that talk about them, and also things that they had written. So one of the interesting things is I've been practicing saying this word, inspired exegesis. Right? And that is rigorous, thoughtful interpretation of the Old Testament. That's what they spent their lives doing. And they would write papers, and they would have discussions. They would have basically debates and things like that. And it's called inspired exegesis. Okay. And perhaps their legacy is the Dead Sea Scrolls, although I've just read that there's some recent archaeology that says they may not have been the responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there may have been another group responsible for that. So the jury's out on that one. Okay. The Zealots. Okay. Zeal, Phineas in Numbers, right? He was rewarded with an eternal covenant with God. Why? Because he acted violently against a Jew that was sleeping with a Moabite woman. That was against the law. And so he was rewarded. But Paul, on the other hand, in Philippians, talks about the downsides of zeal without God's direction. And that's kind of where we find the Zealots later on during the destruction of the temple. This basically started by Judas of Galilee and Zadok the Pharisee. There were several different groups of zealots. That was not just one group. They had different leaders. We'll talk about that. They believed in everything Pharisaic. There were no Hellenist or Sadducee zealots, because the Sadducees, they liked the Romans, but these zealots, they hated the Romans. And every opportunity they got, they would cut their throats, they were really hard on the Romans. They were extremely brutal. But not all of them were violent, but most of them were. And this is interesting that, and Bill and I were talking about this earlier this week. Simon the Zealot in Matthew, right? He was one of Jesus' chosen. And Matthew was a tax collector. He worked for the Romans, right? They would have been absolute enemies. And yet, when Jesus enters the scene, they're not, which is interesting, and it's telling. Okay? And they led the Great Revolt in AD 66. We're going to talk about that and what their part in that was and how it leads to the destruction of the temple. The Idumeans, they were descendants of Esau, and they were actually the Edomites. They were down in this region when the destruction of Jerusalem occurred in 586. The Edomites basically migrated over into the southern part of Judah, and they became the Idumeans. They were forcibly converted to Judaism. And who did that? John Hyrcanus. He was the first Hasmonean. And interestingly, that was absolutely exactly the same thing that the Seleucids were doing to the Jews. The Seleucids were forcibly converting the Jews to Hellenism. He did exactly the same thing. So in my mind, he was no better than the Seleucids. Idumeans were called half-Jews. Okay? They have a major role to play in the story that we're going to explore. Antipater I was an Idumean. He was the first Roman procurator of Judea when Rome annexed Judea. Okay, class assignment. Okay, go look this guy up, Antipater I. Okay, and find out who his descendants are. That's important. Okay. We have the Romans. Founding was in 625. They had the kings. The Roman Republic started up in 510. Interestingly, if you go back to these dates, what's going on in Judea, right? They've been taken off to Babylon, and now they've come back, right? And so there's this thread. It's the God thread, God's plan, right? These things do not just happen. They happen for a reason. This was occurring at the same time something else was happening. And eventually, everything converges. And so these guys didn't accidentally just show up. They were there for a reason. They whipped up on Carthage and Corinth. Julius Caesar comes to the center. There's total chaos. There's wars there. And eventually, Augustus, Octavian becomes Emperor Augustus. He was the first emperor. And we'll be talking about the Eastern and Western Roman empires in our fourth class. But Imperial Rome lasted to 360 A.D. and the Eastern Roman Empire to 1453. That's 1,000 years. That's a long time for that empire to last. Okay. Anyway, they started right here, probably as an effort to protect themselves against the Etruscans, who were like throughout the peninsula there. They banded together, and it turns out they were pretty good at making war. And so eventually they spread out. And they spread up all the way through here, through the entire boot, and then they spread out around the Mediterranean. His name is Antipater I. Antipater I. Okay. And you'll find it to be interesting. Anyway, I think I did. Okay. So this was the extent of the Roman Empire. They started here and expanded down into Spain, up through France, Germany here, all the way up into here, cross over into Britain, over into this region, which is modern-day Turkey, and then down around this region, and then around into North Africa. Notice the Parthian Empire sitting out there, lurking out there, right? And the Romans have some pretty good encounters with them, okay? And we'll talk about that. And then finally, we have the Parthians, and this goes all the way over there. They took over when the Seleucids failed. The Seleucids took over after Alexander the Great failed. Alexander the Great took over, after the Persians failed. And Cyrus was a Persian. He's the one that allowed the Jews to come home. So there was a lot of hand changing over here. This is the Black Sea up here. This is the Mediterranean. And guess where Jerusalem is? And these guys are fighting in this region. This is a key area. We keep saying that. And it really is. There was a rebellion against the Seleucids, and the Seleucids were always defending the land there, and eventually the Parthians took over. So by 40 BC, about the same time that Augustus Caesar takes over, the Parthians are there. And They had conflicts with the Scythians. The Scythians lived up here. They were kind of like the Russians. And the Persians actually went after the Scythians, and the Scythians were drawing them further and further into the lands. And eventually, Cyrus says, no, because if we go further, we'll lose our lines of communication back and forth. So, and all of the food and stuff. So eventually, they just kind of pulled out. Anyway, they live up there. And the Armenians, so they had, the Armenia was right up in here. And we'll talk about this, the conflict between the Seleucids and the Romans over Armenia, which is an interesting story in itself. And then eventually the Parthians overrun Judea, and the Romans basically rescue it. Okay, so we're going to be talking about that kind of stuff. So next time, we'll be talking about, we'll take a road trip to the cross. And this will be talking about the Romans, the civil wars between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the intervention of the Romans. And it is an interesting story, but it's very sad for the people who were caught up in the middle of this. Anyway, that's next time. And 10:03. Okay. All right, I'm done.